We doing okay back here? All right. We got... Just wanted to remind everybody that this book is for sale, and that's one of the reasons that we're here, to present the book and to let you know that it is for sale. There's some softcover copies, and then there's some hardcover copies that are a little more expensive, but they're signed by the authors and the publishers. So check it out, and there's also some free material back there on the table. So take a look at that and take something home with you. Next poet tonight is James Dalessandro, and what I've got here is the James Dalessandro. I used to know him as Jim, but he likes to go as James. So these things change. I was known as Thomas Dawson. Now I'm known as Thomas Rain Crowe. So we change around. You know, we do it a little differently as time goes by. So James Dalessandro, who founded and ran the Santa Cruz Poetry Festival, wrote poetry that was very oral and influenced by Bukowski to a large extent, among others. He was a good friend of Jerry Camstra, author of The Frisco Kid, and used to hang out with Jerry in North Beach. These are my memories. But I would often run into Jim Dalessandro at Vesuvio's on Columbus Avenue and got to know him pretty well, as we were of the same age and had a lot in common. He invited me to read at the Santa Cruz Poetry Festival, so I reciprocated by having him participate in several events I helped stage in San Francisco. I learned a lot about and how to run a festival from him, which later manifested in my work as director of the first annual San Francisco Poetry Festival in 1976. He was well-read, he had done his homework, and he was the real deal. His first book that was out back in those years was Canary in a Coal Mine. Jim, author of poetry and prose, and is still living in the Bay Area in San Rafael. So James Dalessandro.
Good evening, everybody. I'm going to probably make mine a little shorter so that you guys don't have to pay rent going past midnight. A couple things. On the history of things and this wonderful renaissance in the poetry festivals, I wanted to write and be a writer ever since I was a child. And I started, I don't know, age 10 or 11, just before I hitchhiked out here in 1971 from Ohio. I saw a documentary on the beat poets on Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Allen Ginsberg. One of my girlfriends, bless her heart, had given me a copy of Howl, and it was transformative. It changed my life. And when I got here, cocky guy that I was, 22, I walked into City Lights and I said, "Where's the poets and the poetry?" They said, "You're about 10 years too late." So not to be one to take that lying down. A year later, March of 1973, a friend of mine who knew Ken Kesey, I had read Cuckoo's Nest in my psychology class in college, believe it or not. And then I discovered Sometimes a Great Notion, and I was a carpenter. I got off my job and I got paid, and we drove to Ken Kesey's house and got there at 6:30 in the morning, and his wife came out in the bathrobe, and we told her who we were, and 20 minutes later we were eating breakfast with Ken Kesey. And Timothy Leary's wife, Joanna, was sitting at the table, and she wanted to do a benefit and raise awareness. Timothy Leary was sentenced to 6 years in federal penitentiary for 2 roaches, essentially. And so I looked at Ken Kesey and I said, "You know, poetry is dead in San Francisco," they told me. I said, "Maybe it's time we fix that." And Ken Kesey said, "I'll do it, I'm in." And when I got back to San Francisco, another friend, I said, "I need another poet. I have Ken Kesey." And he said, "Well, do you want to go see Lawrence Ferlinghetti?" And I said, "Sure." "Where is he?" He said, "Well, he's upstairs." And I said, it was Lawrence Ferlinghetti's house that he was living in. As I was sitting with Lawrence, across from Lawrence, I looked out a window and I saw train tracks. And I saw the Bay Bridge, and I realized it was the same window in which he had read Starting from San Francisco in the documentary I saw. So this is heady stuff for a 22-year-old. And then and then Lawrence sent me to Michael McClure. And then shortly after that, someone introduced me to Charles Bukowski, with whom I read 6 or 7 times. And so that began the Santa Cruz Poetry Festival, November of 1973, in the worst driving rainstorm ever. Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Jack Michelin almost got blown off. Lawrence wanted to turn around. He begged them to turn around so they wouldn't die on Skyline Boulevard. And I said, nobody's going to come to this fucking thing, man. This is like the worst luck ever, right? And when I got to the Santa Cruz Civic Auditorium, there were 1,800 people standing in line for 3 blocks in every direction. And Lawrence Ferlinghetti said, this is the greatest poetry festival I have ever attended. This is a new birth of American poetry. And my good friend Thomas picked it up from there and really kept it alive when some of us moved on. But that was amazing stuff. I was 23 years old when I read there. I said to myself, this is bizarre shit here. I think I can actually do it. Some of the great poets that influenced me, Charles Baudelaire and Walt Whitman and all of them, they all wrote prose, and they brought to their prose a poetic sense that I felt that taught me that it wasn't determined by the length of the line, but by the quality of the image and the emotion. And I said, I could do this. Bukowski as much as anyone. And I always believe that the great social novels, I always like to mention that the American Civil War was started by a novel by Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852. Tens of thousands of articles about the horror of slavery, and it is a novel that changed American history and started the Civil War and ended the curse of slavery. So I said, if I ever get to be good at this stuff, I'm going to try to use whatever I do to change things. So I don't do poetry so much anymore, but I hope I do poetic fiction. And my last novel, 1906, managed to change San Francisco history. And that's because, this will come as a big shock to all of you, the politicians lied about everything that happened. They claimed that 478 people died. It was probably 10,000. They claimed that the army marched in and kept order amid the chaos. And what they did was got drunk and shot 500 innocent people as suspected looters. And the day before the earthquake and fire, they were about to arrest the entire city administration in a plot that was hatched in Theodore Roosevelt's office in the White House. That was the mayor, all 18 members of the board of supervisors, half the judges and the police chiefs were going to jail, and they handed down the indictments on April 17th, 1906, and the earthquake hit on the morning of the 18th at 5:12 a.m. And those assholes used the chaos and the fire, just like George Bush did the Iraq War, to sort of rehabilitate himself as a great, as a great leader. So I busted their asses with the help of a San Francisco historian named Gladys Hanson. On January 25th, 2005, the city of San Francisco voted unanimously to overturn that death count and recognize that thousands of people had died who were never accounted for. So my novel is narrated by a 23-year-old Italian immigrant, suffragist, socialist. I'm sorry, Jackson, he would call a socialist a communist without conviction, named Annalisa Passarelli. And this is her account. This is her account. She tells the whole story. She is my narrator. And I'm going to make this brief because I don't want you folks to have to pay overtime on the meters. It's called The Unofficial Story. And these are her words. It was a month ago that I finally managed to convince myself I was still alive. That day, a week after the inferno burned out, the fire clap had faded from my ears enough that I was able to hear a knock on the door of our baked Victorian. I arose from a seated position on the floor where I had been typewriting day and night on the Remington and shuffled through inch-deep ash, little clouds erupting with every step. I jerked open the brittle front door and discovered an overdressed man waiting on the soot-covered stoop. He asked for Annalisa Passarelli, opera and theater critic for the Evening Bulletin, cringing at the sight of me. When I said it was she, he lowered the handkerchief he had been clutching to his nose to ward off the acrid smell of burnt everything, and introduced himself as Mr. Charles Appleby. He stated he had been sent by the California State Historian at Sacramento, removed his bowler hat as if preparing for a benediction, and began to cite a litany of the statistics. 300 miles of California coastline reconfigured. Santa Rosa, Palo Alto, San Jose, several dozen other small towns reduced for rubble, from Humboldt County to Monterey. Nearly 500,000 people sent running for their lives, more than 30,000 buildings incinerated, including 37 national banks, the Pacific Stock Exchange, 2 opera houses, hundreds of millions of dollars in smoke and ash. I interrupted to explain that I was aware of the physical losses, having witnessed much of it myself. The undulating crimson veil that colored my field of vision had always subsided enough that I was able to examine the written proffer. After further Appleby emphasis of just how keen everyone was to perpetrate the official fraud, his voice filtered through the metal-on-metal shriek that replaced the fire's throb in my ear. I returned his document and gave a shake of my frazzled head, sending a faint halo of ash floating down on him. He returned to his carriage with the half-skipping gait usually seen on tourists who inadvertently wander, or once wandered, into the Barbary Coast after dark. The dappled mare tethered to the black runabout was as anxious to leave as was queasy Mr. Appleby. Had I accepted his offer, I would have been at 22 the youngest of the deceitful 6 and the only woman to write her memoir. Add that I was the opera and theater critic for Mr. Fremont Older's Evening Bulletin, a crusading journal that appears to have soundly lost the crusade. I was easily the group's most unlikely candidate. $1,000 was an attractive sum in a city living in army tents, standing in soup lines, or spearing rodents for sustenance, but I was content with my decision as I was not prepared to enter the whoring profession just yet. I had my own version of the story, much of it collected and composed before the horror struck, a version that would do nicely without assistance from City Hall. But I've gotten ahead of myself here, a dangerous state of affairs for a writer. You see, the city of San Francisco is no more. The Paris of the Pacific, the wealthiest and wickedest of American cities, is now nothing but ash in memory. All that remains are blackened docks, the iron puddle of a church bell, a mound of cinders where a school once sat, hilly graveyards of charred bricks and melted iron skeletons, an endless scorch mark that was once the grandest boulevard in the American West, a city of 450,000 frenetic souls shaken from its moorings, burnt to a crisp, vanished from the face of the earth. The fire stopped the block below us here at the crown of Telegraph Hill, sparing only 7 houses where once were 1,000, 7 sully teeth in the mouth of a black gum giant. 7 houses where once sat a raucous Barbary Coast, a majestic Market Street, a teeming Chinatown. 7 houses for all of North Beach and Russian Hill and Cow Hollow and the Embarcadero. I write my story still floating in a sea of ash. Ash that was once the city of San Francisco. Once someone's mansion, someone's opera house, someone's tenement, someone's bakery, someone's someone. My cough sends a fluffy tail snaking across the feathery surface of something that was once precious to someone. I cringe at the further horror by the lies that Mayor Schmitz and his minions attempt to foist upon us. Let me tell you what really happened here before deception triumphs and the truth is lost forever. Let me paint for you the imperial city of San Francisco, part Paris, part Dodge City, literate and boorish, libertine and feudal, a soiled Mecca, a beacon for those who had grown weary of the broken promises of America. San Francisco had invigorated the dream and become the new America. I offer my version of this extraordinary tale, one that began well before the Holocaust. It is a personal observation, part history and part memoir, an attempt to add a human face to a most inhumane series of events. I complete my version of the story cross-legged in a bared Victorian on roasted Telegraph Hill, while the unholy trio of Mayor Eugene Schmitz, political boss Abe Roof, and Napoleon General Frederick Funson meet at a bakery on Fillmore just past the fire line to concoct their account. Their objectives are quite simple: to protect themselves from the hangman's noose, minimize the totality of the horror lest the sane world recoil from our restoration, and defraud history by convincing this was all God's will and not their folly. That's pretty much what I have to say. Thank you.